The hull of the celestial conclave was older than most stars. It floated in the dark between galaxies, a place built by hands that no longer existed, and it held the collected wisdom of 12 civilizations that believed they ruled everything worth ruling. The walls were carved from a stone that glowed faintly blue, and the air inside always smelled like rain on hot metal. Representatives from a dozen species filled the curved seats, their voices rising and falling in languages that clicked, hummed, and sang. They argued about trade routes, they argued about borders, they argued about things that did not matter, because nothing had truly threatened them in a very long time. Grand Arbiter Zorvan sat at the center of it all, towering above the rest. He was old. Not old the way a tree is old, or a mountain, but old the way a scar is old. Something left behind by a wound the universe had mostly forgotten. His body was covered in dark plates of natural armor, and his 6 eyes moved independently, watching everything at once. He had led the conclave for 3,000 years, and in all that time, he had learned one lesson above all others. The galaxy did not care about power. It only cared about survival. So when the message arrived that a new species had developed faster than light travel and was requesting an audience, Zorvan did not celebrate. He did not smile. He felt something cold move through his chest, something he had not felt in centuries. He felt afraid. The species called themselves humans. They came from a small rocky world orbiting a very ordinary yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. Their ships were crude. Their lifespans were shockingly short, barely 100 years at best. By every measure the conclave used to judge a civilization, they were nothing special. But Zorvan knew something the others did not. He left the hall without a word and descended into the deep archives, a place so far beneath the station that the lights flickered and the air grew thin. No one came here. The records stored in these vaults were older than the conclave itself, left behind by a civilization known only as the Architects. No one knew what the Architects looked like. No one knew where they went. They had simply existed, built wonders that defied understanding, and then vanished, leaving behind only silence and sealed files. Zorvan found the one he was looking for. It was stored in a case made of a material that could not be scratched, burned, or broken. He opened it with hands that trembled slightly, and read the words that had been etched into a thin sheet of crystal, thousands of years before any current conclave species had learned to make fire. The warning was simple. It said, "When the species from the 3rd planet of the yellow star comes to you, do not provoke them. Do not corner them. Do not underestimate them. They are not the strongest, the fastest, or the smartest. They are something far worse. They adapt, they endure, and they never ever stop." Zorvan read it twice. Then he carried it back to the hall and placed it on the central table where everyone could see it. The reaction was exactly what he expected. Ambassador Tyelis of the Draven Sovereignty was the first to laugh. She was young for a diplomat, her green scales still bright and unblemished, her golden eyes sharp with ambition. They had built their empire by swallowing weaker species whole, and Tyelis had risen through the ranks by being smarter and more ruthless than anyone around her. She picked up the crystal sheet, read it, and set it back down with a look of amusement. "This is what you are worried about?" she said. "A warning from ghosts about a species that lives on one planet and dies before they reach 100? Grand Arbiter, with respect, I think your age is finally showing." Several others laughed with her. The tall, silver-skinned Marathi delegate nodded in agreement. The insectoid Vrelshi clicked their jaws in what passed for a chuckle. Even the usually cautious Pelori ambassador seemed unimpressed. Zorvan said nothing. He simply watched them with all 6 eyes and waited for the laughter to stop. "I have lived long enough to know that the architects were never wrong," he said quietly. "Not once, about anything. Every warning they left, every prediction they made, every piece of knowledge they stored in these archives has proven to be exactly correct. They mapped stars that had not yet been born. They predicted the rise and fall of civilizations that did not exist when they wrote their records. And they chose to warn us about this one small species from this one small world. I suggest we ask ourselves why." The hall was quiet for a moment. Then Tyelus waved a clawed hand dismissively and said, "Because they were afraid of anything they could not control. That is always the way with old civilizations. They see threats in shadows." Zorvan looked at her for a long time. "I hope you are right," he said, "for all our sakes." While this argument played out in the ancient hall, a ship called the Starbound Heron dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of conclave space. It was not a large ship. It was not a beautiful ship. It was functional and practical, built by people who cared more about whether something worked than whether it looked impressive. On the bridge, Captain Danny Marshall leaned back in his chair and looked at the view screen. The border station ahead of them was enormous, a spinning ring of metal and light that could have held a small city. His crew was quiet, staring at it with wide eyes. Most of them had never seen anything built by another species before. "Well," Danny said, running a hand through his short brown hair, "that's something." His second-in-command, Lieutenant Katie Summers, stood beside him with her arms crossed. She was shorter than him by a full head, with red hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it was permanently ready for an argument. "Something is one word for it," she said. "I count at least 40 weapons platforms on that station." "Noted," Danny said calmly. Sergeant Cole Bryant, the head of their Marine detail, stepped onto the bridge. He was wide enough to fill a doorway, and had a face that looked like it had been used to stop a few punches over the years. "Captain, the crew is nervous. Should I say something to them?" Danny thought about it. "Tell them to be polite, be professional, and remember that we are here to make friends. And if anyone asks about Earth, do not mention the world wars until at least the second meeting." Cole grinned. "Yes, sir." The Starbound Heron moved forward toward the station, small and unremarkable against the vastness of space. The crew did not know that their species had already become the subject of a fierce debate. They did not know that an ancient warning had been pulled from a vault because of them. They did not know that an ambitious ambassador was already looking at them the way a predator looks at something it believes is easy prey. Tyelus returned to her quarters that night and opened a secure channel to her homeworld. Warlord Cassett's scarred face appeared on the screen, his one good eye burning with interest as she spoke. "There is a new species," she said. "Young, weak, barely out of their own system. Their ships are primitive, their bodies are fragile, and the Conclave is going to waste months debating whether to let them join." She paused and smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "I believe we should welcome them into the galaxy ourselves, on our terms." Cassif leaned forward. "How many ships do they have?" "Not enough," Tyelus said. On the Starbound Heron, Danny Marshall stood alone in his quarters, looking out the window at the stars. But he had spent his whole career preparing for things he could not predict, and he had learned long ago that the universe had a habit of testing people who were not ready. He planned to be ready anyway. The Horizon Ring was built to impress, and it did its job well. The diplomatic station was a massive wheel of glass and metal, spinning slowly around a dying red star, its corridors wide enough for species of every shape and size. Light poured through the curved windows in shades of deep crimson, and the floors were polished so smooth that every step echoed twice. It was the kind of place designed to make visitors feel small, and for most species, it worked. Danny Marshall walked through the main corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, his boots clicking on the polished floor. Katie Summers walked beside him, her eyes moving constantly, counting exits and cameras out of habit. Behind them came Dr. Nora Beckett, the ship's chief medical officer and xenobiologist, a tall woman with calm gray eyes, and the kind of patience that came from years of studying things that tried to bite her. Next to her was Specialist Levi Grant, their communications officer, young and eager, carrying a small tablet loaded with translation software he had spent the entire trip improving. They had been given quarters on the station, the smallest quarters, in the lowest section, near the waste processing systems. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, and the beds were designed for a species with 4 legs. Katie looked at the beds, looked at Danny, and said absolutely nothing, which was somehow louder than if she had shouted. "It's fine," Danny said. "We're not here for the beds." "We're not here to be insulted either," she muttered. "Actually," Danny said, sitting down on one of the strange beds and immediately sliding off it, "I think that might be exactly why we're here, to see if we can take it." The formal welcome ceremony was held in the Great Hall of the Horizon Ring, a round chamber with a domed ceiling painted with star maps. Representatives from all 12 conclave species were present, arranged in a curved row of elevated seats that looked down at the floor where the human delegation stood. The arrangement was not accidental. It was designed to make the newcomers look up at their betters. Danny looked up, smiled pleasantly, and introduced himself as though he were meeting neighbors at a backyard gathering. Several of the alien delegates seemed confused by his casual tone. Ambassador Tylus watched from her seat, with her golden eyes half closed, like a cat watching a mouse that had not yet noticed the danger. The first day was filled with formal speeches, most of which were thinly disguised lectures about how young species should respect the traditions and authority of the conclave. Danny sat through all of them without complaint. Katie Summers ground her teeth so hard that Nora Beckett quietly passed her a pain reliever. The humans were seated at the far end of a long table, away from the important delegates. The food provided for them was a gray paste that technically met their nutritional needs, but looked and tasted like wet cement. The alien delegates ate elaborate meals and did not look in their direction. Levi Grant sat quietly through most of the dinner, watching. He had spent years studying nonverbal communication, and what he saw worried him. The Draven delegation was not simply ignoring the humans. They were communicating with each other through small gestures, a tap of a claw on the table, a slight turn of the head, a flick of the tail. It was coordinated. It was deliberate. He leaned over to Danny and whispered, "Captain, the Draven are planning something. I cannot tell what, but they have been signaling each other all evening." Danny did not change his expression. He took another bite of the gray paste, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "Keep watching. Tell me everything." The next day brought a scientific exchange, a tradition where new species shared knowledge with the conclave as a gesture of good faith. Dr. Nora Beckett was chosen to represent humanity, and she stood before the assembled alien scientists with a calm confidence that made several of them uncomfortable. She began by explaining human biology. The aliens listened with mild interest that slowly turned to something else entirely as she continued. She told them about the human immune system, how it learned from every disease it fought and built defenses against future attacks. She told them about vaccination, how humans had discovered that by injecting weakened versions of deadly diseases into their own bodies, they could train themselves to survive. The Marathi scientist in the front row physically recoiled. She told them about surgery, how humans had spent centuries cutting open their own bodies to fix what was broken inside. She told them about organ transplants, how humans would take parts from the dead and put them into the living to keep them alive. The Vrelshi delegate made a sound like breaking glass, which Levi later confirmed was extreme distress. She told them about adrenaline, how the human body could temporarily override its own limits in moments of danger, granting strength and speed beyond normal capacity, at the cost of damage to itself. She told them about endurance hunting, how ancient humans had chased prey across open plains for hours, not because they were faster, but because they simply refused to stop moving until their target collapsed from exhaustion. By the time she finished, the room was very quiet. "You are telling me," the Marathi scientist said slowly, "that your species survives by poisoning itself, cutting itself open, and chasing things until they die of fear." That is a simplified version, but yes, essentially. The silence that followed lasted a very long time. That evening, Grand Arbiter Zorvan requested a private meeting with Captain Marshall. They met in a small room overlooking the dying star, its red light casting long shadows across the floor. Zorvan moved slowly, his age showing in the careful way he lowered himself into his seat. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He placed the crystal sheet on the table between them and said, "This was left by the architects. It is about your species. I want you to read it." Danny picked it up, read it carefully, and set it back down. His face did not change, but his eyes grew a little harder, a little more focused. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because I am old enough to trust the beings who wrote it," Zorvan said, "and because some members of this conclave are not. They look at you and see something small and fragile. They see an opportunity." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grand Arbiter, I appreciate the honesty, truly, and I want you to know that we came here looking for friends, not enemies. But I also want you to know something about my people." He leaned forward slightly. "We know what it is like to be underestimated. It usually does not end well for the other side." Zorvan studied him with all 6 eyes. He had met thousands of leaders from hundreds of species over his long life. Most of them spoke with bluster or fear, or carefully rehearsed confidence. This human spoke with something different. It was not arrogance. It was certainty, the deep, quiet certainty of someone who had been tested before, and knew exactly what he was capable of. It was, Zorvan realized, the most unsettling thing he had heard in a very long time. Later that night, a Draven operative attempted to breach the computer systems of the Starbound Heron. The Draven had some of the best electronic warfare specialists in the galaxy, and human technology was supposed to be primitive. The operative hit the first layer of encryption and paused, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Each layer was different from the last, using completely different methods, different logic, different mathematical foundations. It was as if the humans had built their security systems while assuming that every person in the universe was actively trying to break in at all times, which, as it turned out, was exactly what they had assumed. Humanity had spent centuries fighting itself online before it ever reached the stars. Every government had hacked every other government. Every corporation had spied on every other corporation. Teenagers in basements had breached military networks for fun. The result was a species that treated digital security the way other species treated breathing, as something so essential that neglecting it was unthinkable. The Draven operative spent 6 hours trying to crack the outer defenses of the Heron systems. He failed completely. When he reported back to Warlord Kasif, the old warrior sat in silence for a long time, the first faint flicker of doubt crossing his scarred face. But doubt was not enough to stop him. He had conquered 11 species. He had never lost a war. And he was not about to let a race of soft, short-lived creatures from a small blue world be the first to change that record. In the darkness of space, far from the horizon ring, Draven warships were already moving into position. Their hulls were painted black to match the void, and their weapons were charged and ready. The fleet was enormous. Hundreds of ships carrying thousands of soldiers, all pointed at a small human colony world called New Elysium. On the starbound Heron, Katie Summers stood on the bridge, staring at the long-range sensors. Something was wrong. She could feel it the way a sailor feels a coming storm, not through any one signal, but through the absence of signals, through the strange quiet in sectors that should have been busy. She opened a channel to Danny's quarters. "Captain, I think we need to talk." Danny's voice came back, calm and steady as always. "I know. I have been thinking the same thing." The galaxy was about to learn something that the architects had known long ago. You could ignore a warning. You could laugh at it, dismiss it, and throw it aside, but that did not make it any less true. And the truth, like the species it was written about, had a way of catching up with you, whether you were ready or not. New Elysium was not a beautiful world. It was rocky, windy, and cold for most of the year. Its mountains were sharp and gray. Its rivers ran fast and icy, and the soil had to be treated for 3 years before it would grow anything useful. But the people who lived there loved it fiercely, because they had built it from nothing with their own hands. Governor Amy Dalton stood on the roof of the colony's main administration building and watched the sun rise over the eastern ridge. She was a short woman with strong arms and calloused hands, a former engineer who had helped lay the first foundation stone of the colony 12 years ago. She had built water treatment plants, power grids, and housing blocks. She had delivered supplies through blizzards and repaired generators in the dark. She was not the kind of person who scared easily. So when the early warning system screamed to life at 6 in the morning, she did not panic. She walked inside, looked at the data on the screen, and said 3 words to her deputy. "Wake everyone up." The Draven fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, like a hammer falling from the sky. 300 warships filled the space above New Elysium, their black hulls blotting out the stars. Warlord Kassith stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Teeth of Kassith, and watched the small blue-green world below him with his one good eye. He had conquered 11 species. 11 worlds had knelt before him. This would be 12. He sent a single message to the surface: "Surrender now, and we will be merciful." Amy Dalton read the message, deleted it, and activated the colony defense protocols. Every human colony had them. It was one of the first things humanity had agreed upon when it began settling other worlds. No matter how peaceful things seemed, every colony would maintain emergency shelters, weapons caches, communication relays, and evacuation plans. Other species thought this was paranoid. Humans knew it was survival. They had learned that lesson the hard way, through centuries of wars, disasters, and catastrophes on their home world. They never forgot. Within 30 minutes, the colony was transformed. Civilians moved into underground shelters in organized groups, carrying supplies they had packed long before this day. Engineers disabled bridges and roads to slow ground forces. Communication teams activated hidden relay stations in the mountains, and every man and woman who could hold a weapon picked one up. Kassith sent his ground forces down in heavy dropships, expecting the landing to be simple. The first wave touched down in a wide valley south of the main settlement. 5,000 Draven soldiers stepped out onto human soil, armed with plasma rifles and wearing heavy battle armor. They were tall, powerful, and experienced. They had done this many times before. The valley exploded. The humans had mined it 3 hours before the landing. Buried charges ripped through the ground beneath the dropships, sending metal and dirt flying into the air. Before the Draven soldiers could recover, gunfire erupted from the ridgeline above them. Human fighters lay hidden among the rocks, wrapped in thermal blankets that masked their body heat, firing with a precision that came from years of training and generations of warfare. The Draven fought back hard. They were professional soldiers, and they adapted quickly, forming defensive positions and returning fire with their superior weapons. But the humans did not stand still. They hit and ran, disappeared into tunnels, and reappeared somewhere else, set traps and false trails, and used every feature of the rocky landscape to their advantage. They fought the way their ancestors had fought for thousands of years, not with overwhelming force, but with cleverness, speed, and a refusal to give up ground without making the enemy pay for every step. Corporal Ben Harlow was 22 years old and had been stationed on New Elysium for less than a year. He was skinny, quiet, and had joined the Marines because the colony had paid for his education in return for 4 years of service. He had never expected to actually fight anyone. When the attack began, his unit was stationed at a mountain pass on the eastern ridge, the only route wide enough for Draven armored vehicles to reach the underground shelters where the civilians were hiding. His commanding officer was killed in the first hour. The rest of his unit was scattered by a Draven airstrike. Ben found himself alone on a narrow ledge of rock, looking down at a column of enemy vehicles moving toward the pass. He had a rifle with limited ammunition, a bag of mining explosives that the colony engineers had given him that morning, and absolutely no backup. He stayed anyway. For 9 hours, Ben Harlow held that pass. He collapsed the entrance with explosives, forcing the vehicles to stop. When the Draven soldiers came on foot, he picked them off from above, moving between firing positions so they could not pin him down. When he ran out of human ammunition, he crawled down to a destroyed Draven position and took their weapons. When those ran out, he used the last of the mining charges to trigger a rock slide that buried the lead vehicles under tons of stone. The Draven commander in charge of that column reported back to Cassith that the pass was defended by a heavily fortified human position with an estimated 50 soldiers. Cassith diverted resources to deal with it. It was 6 more hours before they finally fought through and found the truth, that one young man with a bag of explosives and a stubborn heart had held back an entire armored column long enough for every civilian in the eastern shelters to be evacuated deeper underground. Ben Harlow survived. He was found unconscious behind a rock, dehydrated, bleeding from a dozen small wounds, and still holding a broken alien rifle across his chest. When they woke him up, the first thing he said was, "Did the civilians get out?" They had. The human defense fleet above New Elysium was tiny compared to the Draven armada. 12 ships against 300. The math was impossible, and every human officer knew it. They fought anyway. The human ships used their smaller size to move between the Draven formations, staying too close for the heavy weapons to track them effectively. They hid in the planet's asteroid belt and launched ambushes. When ships were too damaged to fight, their crews aimed them at the largest enemy targets and accelerated, turning dying vessels into weapons. It was brutal, desperate, and completely alien to the Draven way of thinking. No species they had ever conquered had fought like this. No species had ever been this willing to bleed. Commander Petra Voss arrived with reinforcements on the second day. She brought 20 ships, still far fewer than the enemy, but Petra Voss was not a woman who counted numbers. She counted opportunities. She had studied the Draven battle formations during the long journey and found a weakness. The Draven arranged their ships in tight, layered walls, which made them powerful in a straight fight, but slow to react to attacks from unexpected directions. So Petra did something the Draven had never seen before. She ordered her ships to make short range faster than light jumps. Tiny hops that lasted less than a second, appearing inside the enemy formation rather than in front of it. The result was chaos. Draven ships suddenly had enemies behind them, beside them, between them. They fired in all directions and hit each other. Command signals were scrambled. The orderly wall of warships collapsed into a confused mess of spinning vessels and friendly fire. Cassith watched from his bridge as his fleet, the largest he had ever assembled, was torn apart by a force a fraction of its size. For the first time in his long career, he gave an order he had never given before. Pull back. The Draven fleet retreated from New Elysium, leaving behind burning wreckage and the bodies of thousands of soldiers. On the surface, the human colonists emerged from their shelters and looked up at a sky that was scarred with the trails of falling debris, but was, once again, their own. News of the battle spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Every species in the conclave received reports, watched recordings, and read the numbers. A single human colony, outnumbered and outgunned, had defeated the most feared military force in known space. In the great hall of the conclave, the delegates sat in stunned silence. Ambassador Tyelis stared at her hands, her scales pale, her golden eyes wide. She had called them weak. She had called them easy prey. Grand Arbiter Zorvan said nothing. He simply walked to the central table, placed the architect's crystal warning where everyone could see it, and returned to his seat. The words glowed faintly in the blue light of the ancient hall, and this time, nobody laughed. On the bridge of the Teeth of Kaseth, Warlord Kaseth sat alone in the dark. His fleet was broken, his reputation was shattered. And somewhere deep inside his old soldier's mind, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning, that the humans were not finished, and that the worst mistake he had ever made was not the attack itself, but the belief that creatures who lived such short, fragile lives could not possibly fight that hard to protect them. He had been wrong, and he knew with a cold certainty that settled in his bones like ice that they were going to make him pay for it. The galaxy expected fire. Every species that had ever been attacked the way humanity had been attacked responded in one of two ways. They either surrendered and begged for peace, or they threw everything they had at the enemy in a blind fury, burning worlds and killing without thought until one side was ash. It was the natural order of things. It was how wars worked. Humanity did neither. Admiral Rick Sutton was a quiet man. He was thin, with graying hair cut short, and pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink at the right times. He spoke softly, moved slowly, and had a habit of sitting in silence for long minutes before making a decision. Officers who did not know him sometimes mistook his calmness for weakness. Officers who did know him understood that the silence was the most dangerous part, because it meant he was thinking, and when Rick Sutton finished thinking, people's lives changed. He stood in the command center of Earth's combined fleet, a room buried deep inside a station orbiting Mars, and looked at the map of Draven space that covered the far wall. 300 star systems, 80 colonized worlds, thousands of warships. The Draven sovereignty was an empire built on conquest, and it was enormous. His staff expected him to pick a target. They expected invasion plans, bombardment orders, lists of Draven worlds to burn in retaliation for New Elysium. Several of his officers had already drawn up proposals. Rick read them all, set them aside, and said, "No." The room went quiet. "We are not going to invade anyone," he said. "We are not going to burn any worlds. We are not going to kill civilians. That is not who we are. And more importantly, it is not how we win this." He pointed at the map. The Draven sovereignty runs on trade. Everything they have, their ships, their weapons, their food supply for the outer colonies, moves through a network of supply routes that connect their systems together. Cut those routes, and their military starves. Their outer worlds lose power. Their people start asking their leaders very uncomfortable questions. He paused. "We do not need to beat them. We need to make it impossible for them to keep fighting." The campaign that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human ships did not charge into Draven territory with guns blazing. Instead, they appeared at critical points along supply routes, disabled cargo vessels without destroying them, and disappeared before Draven warships could respond. They planted sensor buoys that tracked every Draven military movement, and broadcast the information openly, so that even Draven citizens could see where their fleets were going. They intercepted weapon shipments and left food shipments untouched. It was precise. It was patient. And it was devastating. Within weeks, the outer Draven colonies began to feel the pressure. Military bases ran low on ammunition. Shipyards could not get the materials they needed to build new vessels. Soldiers on garrison duty went without fresh supplies. And through it all, the humans never attacked a single civilian target. Not one home, not one school, not one hospital. The Conclave watched in silence. This was not war as they understood it. This was something else, something that frightened them more than brute force ever could. The humans were not trying to destroy the Draven. They were trying to make the Draven destroy themselves. Dr. Isaac Palmer was not a soldier. He was a historian, a civilian advisor who had spent his career studying how civilizations rose, fell, and sometimes found their way back from the edge. He was a small man, with round glasses and a gentle voice. The kind of person who looked completely out of place on a military station. But Admiral Sutton had personally requested his presence, because Rick Sutton understood something that most military leaders did not. Wars are won and lost in the minds of people, not on battlefields. Isaac sat in a recording studio aboard the Fleet Command Station and broadcast a message directly to the Draven people. He spoke in perfect Draven, a language he had learned in 6 weeks, with an intensity that had genuinely alarmed his colleagues. The message was calm, respectful, and absolutely devastating. He told them that humanity had no desire to conquer their worlds or enslave their people. He told them that the soldiers who had died at New Elysium had been someone's children, just like human soldiers, and that their deaths were a tragedy caused by leaders who saw war as a tool for personal glory. He told them the history of humanity, not the version that made humans look good, but the real version, the wars, the atrocities, the centuries of suffering that had taught humans the true cost of violence. And then he told them something that no enemy had ever told the Draven before. He told them about reconciliation. He told them about enemies who had become allies. He described nations that had fought the bloodiest wars in human history, and then, within a generation, built friendships so strong that the idea of fighting each other again became unthinkable. He told them that it was possible to stop, to choose a different path, and that humanity was offering that path right now. The message spread through Draven space like water through cracks in a wall. The military tried to block it. They could not. The humans had routed it through so many channels, bounced it off so many satellites, and embedded it in so many data streams that stopping it would have meant shutting down the entire Draven communication network. On Draven colony worlds, people listened, and for the first time, they began to question. Meanwhile, the Conclave was changing. One by one, species that had dismissed humanity began reaching out quietly. The Marathi sent a trade delegation. The Pelori offered a scientific exchange. Even the cautious Vrelshi opened private diplomatic channels. They had seen what happened to the Draven, and they had made a simple calculation. It was better to be on the side of the species that fought like that than against it. Grand Arbiter Zorvan watched these developments with a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. Hope. But Warlord Kassith was not finished. His reputation was ruined. His fleet was weakened, and his own people were beginning to turn against him. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous kind. He gathered every ship he had left, every soldier, every weapon, and launched one final desperate attack, aimed at the heart of the human fleet near the Korvan corridor. The battle was massive. Hundreds of ships on each side, filling space with fire and light, and the silent explosions that bloomed like deadly flowers in the vacuum. The Draven fought with the fury of a species that knew this was their last chance. The humans fought with the grim determination of a species that had been fighting for its survival since the first of their kind picked up a stone and decided not to die. Katie Summers led a boarding action against Cassit's flagship. She took 50 Marines, including Cole Bryant, and they cut their way through the outer hull of the Teeth of Kaseth, using breaching charges and sheer willpower. The fighting inside was close and brutal, corridor by corridor, room by room. The Draven soldiers were bigger, stronger, and better armored. The humans were faster, more creative, and completely unwilling to stop. Cole Bryant fought through 3 decks with a broken arm, using his rifle one-handed and his voice to keep his squad moving. Katie Summers personally breached the bridge door with a shaped charge, and walked through the smoke to find Warlord Kaseth standing in the center of the room, his weapon raised. He was old, he was scarred, and he was alone. His officers had fled or been captured. His fleet was collapsing around him. He looked at Katie Summers, this small human woman with blood on her face and fire in her eyes, and he understood at last what the architects had tried to warn about. It was not their weapons. It was not their technology. It was the look in their eyes that said they would walk through fire, through pain, through death itself, and never once consider stopping. "I offer my surrender," Kaseth said. Katie could have killed him. She had every reason to. But she lowered her weapon and said, "Accepted. You will be treated fairly. That is how we do things." Kaseth stared at her for a long moment, then he set his weapon on the ground and let the human Marines take him into custody. As they led him away, he passed Cole Bryant in the corridor. The big human was leaning against a wall, his broken arm hanging at his side, grinning through the pain. "Rough day?" Cole said to the most feared warlord in the galaxy. Kaseth looked at him and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Ambassador Tyelis, watching the battle from a safe distance, saw the end coming long before it arrived. She opened a secret channel to the human fleet and offered a ceasefire in exchange for what was left of the sovereignty's dignity. She betrayed Kaseth without hesitation, because Tyelis had always understood one thing clearly: survival mattered more than loyalty. The peace agreement was signed 3 days later. The Draven sovereignty gave up its military expansion, released all conquered species, and agreed to reparations. In exchange, humanity did not take a single Draven world. They did not demand territory. They did not demand submission. They demanded only that it never happen again. Across the galaxy, in quiet rooms and crowded halls, representatives of every species pulled up the architect's warning and read it one more time. The words had not changed, but the way they understood them had changed completely. They had thought "be afraid" meant that humans were monsters. Now they understood that it meant something far more complicated. Be afraid because this species will force you to be better. Be afraid because they will not let you stay comfortable. Be afraid because once they decide something matters, nothing in the universe will make them stop. And the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, was genuinely, deeply afraid. The signal came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It appeared in the navigation systems of the Starbound Heron 3 days after the peace treaty was signed. A low, steady pulse buried inside a frequency that no known species used. Levi Grant found it first, sitting alone at his station in the middle of the night, scanning through background noise the way he always did when he could not sleep. He almost dismissed it as interference. Then he noticed the pattern. It was not random. It was mathematical, a sequence of prime numbers repeated in a spiral pattern that grew more complex with each cycle. It was old. Levi ran the signal through every database he had access to, and the closest match was the energy signature found in architect ruins scattered across the galaxy. But this was not a dead echo from an ancient machine. This was calling. He woke Danny Marshall, who looked at the data, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Where is it coming from?" "A moon," Levi said, "unmarked, uncharted, orbiting a gas giant in a system that every species in the conclave has apparently been avoiding for thousands of years. He paused. Zorvan's people have been guarding it, or maybe guarding everyone else from it. Danny called Katie, Nora, and Cole to the bridge. They gathered around the navigation display and looked at the small gray moon spinning slowly on the screen. It was unremarkable in every way, the kind of place you would fly past without a second glance, which, Danny suspected, was exactly the point. The signal activated after the battle, Levi said quietly. It was dormant before. Whatever is down there, it was waiting for something to happen before it turned on. It was not a question. Danny contacted Grand Arbiter Zorvan through a secure channel. The old alien listened without interruption, his 6 eyes blinking slowly. When Danny finished, Zorvan was silent for a long time. My predecessors placed a watch on that moon 10,000 years ago, Zorvan said finally. The architects left instructions that it was not to be disturbed until the right species came. We assumed it was a weapon. We assumed the right species would be one strong enough to deserve it. He paused. I am beginning to think we misunderstood. We're going to that moon, Danny said. I know, Zorvan said. I think you were always going to. The starbound Heron landed on the surface of the moon 2 days later. The ground was gray dust. The sky was black. And the only feature visible was a low ridge of rock that stretched across the horizon like the spine of some buried creature. Danny led a small team on foot. Katie at his side, Cole watching their backs, Nora carrying scientific equipment, and Levi following the signal with a handheld scanner. They found the entrance at the base of the ridge. It was a doorway carved into the rock, perfectly smooth, perfectly rectangular, and just tall enough for a human to walk through without ducking. Not a Draven, not a Marathi, not a Vrelshi, a human. That's not a coincidence, Katie said, staring at the dimensions. No, Danny agreed. It is not. Inside, the tunnel sloped downward into the dark. The walls began to glow as they walked, a soft white light that seemed to come from inside the stone itself, reacting to their presence. The air was cool and clean, as though it had been sealed and preserved for millennia. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, and with each step, the tunnel grew wider, until it opened into a vast underground chamber, so large that the far wall was lost in shadow. The chamber was filled with machines, not the kind of machines that hummed and sparked and had obvious purposes. These were elegant, abstract shapes of crystal and metal that floated in the air without any visible support, turning slowly, catching the light, and throwing it back in patterns that seemed almost alive. At the center of the chamber stood a single pedestal, and above it hung a sphere of light the size of a human head, pulsing gently with the same rhythm as the signal that had led them here. Nora ran her scanner over the nearest machine and went very still. Captain, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, these machines are functional. All of them. Whatever power source they are using, it has been running for at least 50,000 years without degradation. This technology is so far beyond anything we have ever seen that I do not even have a frame of reference for it. Danny walked to the pedestal and stood before the sphere of light. As he approached, it brightened, and a voice filled the chamber. It was not a sound exactly. It was more like a thought that arrived fully formed, clear and warm, and impossibly old. You are here, the voice said. We have waited a very long time. The message played for nearly an hour. It was not a recording in the traditional sense. It was a living document, something that seemed to adjust its language and complexity based on who was listening. It spoke in English, in simple words, with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the universe. The architects explained what they were. They had been the first intelligent species in the galaxy, born so long ago that the stars they knew had since died, and been replaced. They had explored everything, mapped everything, and understood more about the nature of reality than any civilization that followed. And in all their millions of years of existence, they had studied every species that rose, thrived, and eventually fell. They had cataloged thousands of intelligent civilizations. Each one followed a pattern. They would grow, reach a certain level of power, and then either stagnate, destroy themselves, or become so rigid in their thinking that they could no longer adapt to a changing universe. Every single one, without exception. Except one. The architects had found Earth long before humans existed. They had watched the planet through probes and sensors for millions of years, tracking the slow evolution of life. And when humans finally appeared, the architects saw something they had never seen in any other species across the entire history of the galaxy. Humans could hold contradictions inside themselves without breaking apart. They could be violent and compassionate in the same breath. They could wage terrible wars and then build hospitals for their enemies. They could hate and love with equal intensity, sometimes directed at the same person in the same moment. They could believe in logic and superstition simultaneously. They could be selfish and selfless, cruel and kind, terrified and brave, all at the same time. Every other species the architects had studied was defined by a single dominant trait. The Draven were defined by dominance. The Marathi were defined by caution. The Vrelshi were defined by order. When circumstances changed in ways that conflicted with their core trait, they could not adapt. They broke. They fell. Humans bent. They absorbed the impact and reshaped themselves around it. They did not break, because they were never a single thing to begin with. They were everything, all at once, a chaotic mess of competing impulses held together by nothing more than stubborn will and the desperate belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The architect's warning to the galaxy was not what everyone had assumed. It was not, "Be afraid of humans because they will destroy you." It was, "Be afraid of humans because they will change everything, and you will not be able to stop it." And the gift they had left behind was not a weapon. It was a library, a vast, impossibly detailed archive of architect knowledge, technology, science, and philosophy, stored in the machines that filled the chamber. It contained answers to questions that no living species had even thought to ask. And it had been sealed, locked, and hidden on this forgotten moon with one simple instruction: do not open until the humans come. Because the architects believed, after millions of years of watching the universe, that humans were the only species with enough flexibility, enough stubbornness, and enough irrational hope to take that knowledge and use it to do what the architects themselves had never managed to do: unite the galaxy. Not through force, not through fear, but through the simple, maddening, beautiful human refusal to accept that something was impossible. Danny Marshall stood in the chamber for a long time after the message ended. His team was silent around him. Katie had tears on her face, which she would later deny. Cole was standing very straight, his jaw tight. Nora was already reaching toward the nearest machine, her scientific curiosity overriding every other emotion. Levi was sitting on the floor, with his head in his hands, overwhelmed. "Well," Danny said finally, "that is a lot to process." 3 weeks later, he stood before the full celestial conclave and shared what they had found. Grand Arbiter Zorvan listened to every word, and when Danny finished, the old alien did something that no one in the hall had ever seen him do. He smiled. "I propose," Zorvan said, his ancient voice filling the chamber, "that humanity be granted a permanent seat on this conclave. Not as a junior member, not as an observer, as an equal." The vote was not unanimous. Some species still feared what humanity would become. But it passed, and when it did, a sound moved through the hall that had not been heard there in living memory. Alien hands and claws and limbs striking together in a gesture they had learned from the humans. Because humans, as always, had a way of making their habits spread to everyone around them. In the final scene, Danny stood on the bridge of the Starbound Heron, looking out at the stars. The ship was heading home. Behind them, the galaxy stretched out in all directions, vast and ancient and full of possibilities that had not existed a year ago. Katie walked up beside him. "Do you think we are ready for this?" she asked. Danny thought about Ben Harlow holding a mountain pass alone. He thought about Petra Voss jumping her ships into an impossible position. He thought about Nora lecturing horrified aliens about vaccination. He thought about a species that had nearly destroyed itself 100 times over and had clawed its way back every single time. Not because it was the best, but because it refused, absolutely and stubbornly refused, to give up. "Probably not," he said. "But when has that ever stopped us?" The starbound heron flew on into the dark, small and unremarkable against the vastness of space, carrying inside it the stubborn, contradictory, infuriating, magnificent hope of a species that had always believed, against all evidence, that tomorrow would be better. And far away, carved into stone that had lasted 50,000 years, the architect's warning still glowed faintly in the dark. Centuries later, a galactic historian would record that the words were eventually carved into the entrance of every diplomatic hall in known space. Not as a threat, not as a caution, as a promise.